Good morning. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Sarah Rubin, and I'm with the Institute for Local Government. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself and my organization in just a moment. But we are all so excited for our webinar this morning, the 120-day deadline, how local governments can conduct community-based address canvassing to ensure low-income people are counted. We are so pleased that folks from cities, counties, special districts, and other nonprofits and interested folks are joining us today. And we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers. If we want to go to the second slide. Great. So I'll start with just a little bit about myself and my organization, and then I'll introduce our other fantastic speakers, including Jacob Modell, Zuma Maciel, and Ed Kassam, folks I really enjoy working with. So first of all, just briefly, me, again, my name is Sarah Rubin, and I'm the director of the Institute for Local Government's Public Engagement Program. And for those who are not familiar with the Institute for Local Government, we are the research and education nonprofit affiliate of the League of California Cities, the California State Association of Counties, and the California Special Districts Association. And my background is that I'm a mediator and meeting facilitator, and I've had the wonderful opportunity to work in almost every part of our beautiful and diverse state of California. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our other speakers. Zuma Maciel has over 20 years of public administration experience and is a versatile leader with expertise in public policy development, government administration, and legislative work. Most of her work at the City of San Jose and her public service has been dedicated to establishing violence prevention and intervention strategies and managing a $15 million grant portfolio. She is absolutely, I can say personally, a joy to work with, and what she has done with the City of San Jose has been incredibly impressive to me personally. So I'm very pleased to be with you today, Zulma. Jacob Modell is the Vice President of Research at Community Connect Labs. He leads up their census-related work. And Ed Kassam is a trustee of the Family Fund and a member of the Census Funders Initiative, which is a national network working to assure a fair and accurate Census 2020. He conducted and published research on immigrants in the U.S. and the census undercount of minorities and immigrants over the past 3 decades. And his research has included special attention to low-income minority and immigrant households residing in unconventional housing, which is likely to be left off the Census Bureau address list, and we know is a major cause of the undercount and is a major focus of our webinar today. Before we continue on, I do want to say that the League of Cities and the Association of Counties and the Special Districts Association are all committed to a complete count. And we all know it's very important that local governments do have a complete count because it will help them to get their fair share. And another thing that I recently learned, which some of you may be familiar with, is LUCA, the local update of census addresses, was actually instituted because local governments wanted to be more connected to the address update and the effort to get ready for the census. So when you speak a little bit from now, you can speak a little bit more about history, but it's absolutely fascinating. So those are our 4 speakers, and I'm going to go over our agenda for the webinar today. If we want to go to the next slide. So we're just about finished with our welcome and introductions. in a moment, I'm going to hand things over to Jacob to talk about the 2020 census and key sources of the undercount. Then we will be hearing about the San Jose experience from Zulma. Ed is going to talk with us about results from a number of California pilots. And then we'll go back to Jacob to talk about the timeline that folks might want to consider as far as community-based address canvassing. We're hoping to have a nice amount of time for Q&A before we wrap up and end at 11 a.m. So, Jacob, I will then hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. So I thought I'd first talk a little bit about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I thought I would first talk a little bit about our organization, Community Connect Labs. So basically what we do is we try to work with nonprofits, governments, foundations, and even mission-driven companies or CSR units to provide easy ways to engage low-income communities, primarily via text messaging. And so that could be SMS or other mobile messaging applications as well that are commonly used, such as Facebook Messenger. Next slide. And we work with a variety of folks ranging from hospitals to San Jose, obviously, as well as all over the country, including work in Pittsburgh and New York, but we're primarily located in California. Next slide. And you might ask yourself, why actually engage folks through text messaging? And the answer for us has to do primarily with speed and also reach. So as you all probably know, because you have a cell phone in your pocket, you know, nearly everyone has access to a cell phone now. It's free for a lot of people through the Lifeline plan, also known as Obama phones, for people who don't have a lot of money. And even we do work with even homeless clients where a large number of people who are homeless, you know, this is an important piece of technology that they use in order to access services. The other issue is speed, which is that unlike email or normal mail or even phone calls, you know, text messages are actually tend to be read and tend to be read relatively quickly. And the last reason is also convenience. So, you know, people live very busy lives. You may be on a webinar, for example, or you may be working unconventional hours or what have you, and texting is convenient. You can receive a text message at any time of day and answer it when it's a good time for you, rather than a phone call or other means that might, you know, interrupt you. Next slide. So for us, it's important that that to use text messaging because it works on relatively on basic phones, feature phones, low-end Android phones, what have you. And we're also able to provide these sorts of services in multiple languages. And we'll talk a little bit about that with the San Jose project as well. And it's very low cost for folks. So unlike phone calls or other things, text messaging under most cell phone plans are free, and you know, you don't have to use much cell phone data or anything like that to be able to use at least our product. Next slide. So we want to talk about a specific application of this technology to the census on community-based address canvassing. So what this really is about is engaging community members to do what historically the census has done, which is walk around neighborhoods and try to find units that might be missing from conventional sources of the census addresses. So the census relies primarily on the post office U.S. Postal Service and other administrative records in order to combine and have a sample to actually go out and figure out where to knock, where to send census forms, that sort of thing. That's kind of the first step in doing a census. The issue is, particularly in California, a lot of people do not live in places that have mailboxes or may not be, a part of administrative records for a variety of reasons. So they might be living in converted garages, they may be living in trailers, they may be living in in-law units, those sorts of things. And this is a critical source of undercount. And what this slide tries to illustrate is, this is really the first and in some sense, we feel a really high leveraged way to address the undercount, because if a house is missing from this so-called master address file that the census builds, then it's, it never receives a census form, it never receives any follow-up enumeration, and it isn't even imputed, or the census doesn't even guess how many folks are living there because it doesn't know that it actually exists. That said, it's not the only source of undercount for sure. There's other concerns we particularly have around recruiting enumerators that are high quality, so from local communities who speak local languages. And then lastly is the imputation part is avoiding imputation. So this is the get out the count effort and doing things to make sure folks actually respond. So the first, missing households, relates to LUCA. Low quality enumeration relates to enumerator recruitment. And then finally, the imputation is around getting out the count to make sure that the census doesn't have to do these guesses, which tend to be biased against particularly minority communities. Next slide. So we feel that there's a lot of ways that local governments can help. LUCA, as previously mentioned, is one way where local governments have an opportunity, and it's a short window, only 120 days, and for most cities and counties ending in late June or early July, to actually get their own version of the master address file and compare to see if it matches their own records. This is also where community-based address canvassing comes in. That's one tool in which local governments can use to sort of supplement their existing records to make sure that the master address file includes unconventional housing units. We also feel that local governments can play, particularly ones that have workforce development initiatives and other things around enumerator recruitment. These are really, really great jobs, and there's preferential hiring for hard-to-count neighborhoods. So there seems like there's a lot of aligned incentives there for local governments. They pay $20 to $25 an hour, and they're really flexible. And then the last two buckets on the right are about, there's a lot of concerns, especially with the current federal administration, about data privacy in regards to census, especially with the addition of particularly sensitive questions. And so, and there are also a lot of misconceptions around data privacy with the census. So trying to explain to folks, that the census is really for everyone, regardless of citizenship status, for example, and that there are really strong federal safeguards for this data is really important. And then lastly is the actual get out the count efforts. The census certainly does a lot here, but we feel that local governments can play a greater role in sort of supporting this work locally and using sort of local innovations that match their communities better than what might be designed, further afield. Next slide. Yeah, so if you want to get an idea about what the actual product and process for community-based canvassing, if you have your cell phone, and we'll pause for a minute, you can actually text this word without the quotes, the demo one, to this number. And that will give you a sort of introductory experience for what the actual tool that we designed is. So I'll just pause for 1 minute. Okay, so for those of you who had a cell phone handy and were able to do it, what you'll notice is when you text this in, it starts a mini sort of survey. And what this survey is designed to do, it's designed for folks who go out into the field, into neighborhoods, to be able to anonymously report unconventional housing units by answering just a few questions about how many units there are on the property, some short descriptions like color, where it is located on the property, what type of unit, is it a garage, is it an in-law unit, that sort of thing. And then the last step is to actually send a geolocation pin. And what we do is we take this data on the back end and process it and format it so that it's really easy for local governments to include as part of their LUCA updates. So next slide. So here are just some screenshots of some of the questions. You'll notice they're multiple choice. Importantly, we've made this available in several languages. So in San Jose, we made it available in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. And in fact, 40% of the addresses that were submitted were not submitted in English. And this is part of our work and our commitment to engage local community members who know their communities best and honestly will do a better job identifying these kinds of units and and ultimately ensuring that there's a fair and accurate count. So next slide. So the specific data that's collected, I was describing a little bit, is the longitude and latitude, which is the most critical, and that leverages the GPS on one's phone, the street address of the unit, as well as these sort of basic descriptions. And I will say our technology is not the only technology that local governments have used for this. So they've used Esri products such as Survey 123, or even sent staff in many cases to do a similar exercise. But this is the data that needs to be collected regardless of what your tool is. The reason why we designed our tool this way is you might have noticed that when you did our demo, you didn't have to install any applications. There was no account you had to create. I didn't have to ask you what kind of phone you had to make sure it was compatible. It just kind of worked. And we feel that this is an incredible, if you're going to engage community members, especially who may not be especially technologically literate, most people know how to use a cell phone. And so it only would take us 10 minutes or so to train people on how to use the technology side of this. Most of the trainings that we do have to do with the content and how you identify these units. So next slide. So just to give an illustration of what these kind of units that we've been talking about are, we pose a question of, at least if you're in the Bay Area and you make close to minimum wage, where might you actually kind of live if you're a family of 4? So next slide. Here are some real examples of neighborhoods that we walked around. On the left is the Excelsior in San Francisco, which is a lower middle class neighborhood, sort of towards the south side of San Francisco. On the right are some photos from a suburb of Oakland called Richmond, California, which has about 100,000 people and is also known for having pockets of poverty, unfortunately. And what you'll notice on the left in that picture of that duplex is you'll see right next to the garage door, there's what looks like another entrance with actually even a mail slot. And so this is a duplex that has been converted, or actually an apartment with a garage below that's been converted into essentially a duplex. On the right, you'll notice there's an RV that actually has a separate yard and even a separate entrance parked on someone's property. And also below, there's a converted garage. So you'll notice there's a black security door right next to a white security door, even with a security camera. And so these are instances of housing units that don't have official addresses, that may not have a post box, but are certainly, there's pretty good evidence even from the street that folks are living there. Next slide. And so here's a zoomed out picture of the Excelsior neighborhood where we were walking around with some CBOs. And you'll notice that in some neighborhoods, it's really widespread. So on this block something like 40–50% of the actual structures had this kind of setup where they had converted their garages into separate living spaces with separate entrances. So next slide. And you might ask yourself, are there official data sources that might have these kind of records? And in many cases, there might be from utility bills or other data sources that you all might have. I will say that in our experience looking at some of the official data sources, as well as talking with Census, who was a critical partner in helping us design this tool, there seem to be a lot of missing unconventional units from official sources. So in this case, this is from the San Francisco County Property Assessor's Office. This is a really common place for addresses that cities and counties use in order to find addresses missing from the master address file. And here's one of the units you just saw. And you'll notice that, at least according to the property assessors, the county assessor's office, that they only show one unit as part of this, where it was pretty clear that there were two. And this was true for that entire block. So it's something where we feel that a lot of these types of units are likely to be missed in official data sources. Next slide. And the other thing that's important to know is it's not like Census knows about this for sure, and due to budget cuts, so in prior censuses, they actually walked around most of the blocks to actually have people do this kind of work and look for those unconventional units and what have you. But this time around, they're doing primarily what's called in-office canvassing, where they're looking at before and after pictures of satellite photos, which does a really great job for things like colonias and Native American reservations or other sort of rural settings of finding new structures. But for particularly more urban or suburban areas, satellite images really aren't a great way to find these units. So here are two satellite images, once again, of properties that I had showed you on the previous slides, and it's really hard to tell that on the right that there's a converted garage, and on the left that there's also another converted garage in one of those duplexes in the Excelsior. Next slide. So now, I wanted to turn it over to Zulma, who helped coordinate with the CBOs in San Jose for our initial pilot, and is also working on to help coordinate some of the future work that San Jose is doing in order to ensure that these types of units are counted.
Hi, good morning. Can everyone hear me? Okay, probably. Good. Again, this is Zulma Maciel. I'm with the City Manager's Office in the city of San Jose. It is my pleasure to be with the other members of the team, Sarah, Ed, and Jacob, who've helped coordinate this webinar, but also were a very instrumental part of the pilot project that we did last fall. Why this is important for the city of San Jose is because we believe that there was a significant undercount in the last census of 2010, where as much as 70,000 people were not counted at least, which results in about $20 million annually that we could have received in resources and in funds, federal funds, state funds, and so forth. And so this is now really an opportunity for us to update our master address list, number one. Number two, begin to talk about the census to the communities in San Jose, specifically those that have a little apprehension about government in general and who are fearful particularly of things that are happening at the national landscape. So it's an opportunity for us to do that, to message the importance of the census well ahead of schedule. And it also allows us the opportunity to continue to work with our community-based organizations that know the communities well, and that will also eventually help us in the census work over the next year and a half, or 2 years, really. Next slide. So what we did for the city of San Jose is we identified nonprofit organizations or community-based organizations that we already work with. And we also identified a couple of organizations that the city worked with in the previous census that were somewhat aware of LUCA, but had not worked on LUCA projects before, but were aware of the census project. So we identified 5 organizations that committed to implement the pilot. There was a little uncertainty about what they were going to do, how they were going to use this technology, the texting tool, what that would mean while they were canvassing the neighborhoods and how long that would take. And for the city of San Jose, we honestly didn't know. We knew that we wanted to do this, but we were unaware of what it would take to actually lift this project. And what we found was that the nonprofit partners were willing to learn with us. And we had a launch meeting where we talked about what LUCA means and how this tool would be used. And then we had a couple, maybe 2 more meetings after that to talk about the design of this. So how would we recruit volunteers? How would we train them? How would we organize them? How would we identify the priority census tracts that we wanted to test this at, and about how many volunteers we would need? So again, just tested this, and it turned out to be pretty good, and Ed will get into the results later. But what's important here is that once you have the training materials and once you know kind of what you're getting into, and we have some lessons learned, it's really quite easy. So what we did was we had a 3-hour train the trainer workshop. We invited our partner organizations. Like I said, it was 5 or 6 by the end of this, and they each had about 2 representatives from the organizations attend a Friday workshop to learn more about this texting tool and the approach to canvassing a neighborhood. What we've learned is that we don't need 3 hours anymore. 45 minutes or so to train our nonprofit partners who will train the volunteers is sufficient. So we've streamlined the training guidelines. We've streamlined the training in general. And then the community-based organizations were responsible for recruiting the volunteers. And then on the Saturday morning that we identified we would do the canvassing, they would do a morning training with their volunteers on using the tool. It turned out that we didn't really need a full hour. For some groups, 30 minutes was sufficient. For groups of volunteers where there were high school students, they picked this up in 15 minutes. They tested it and they wanted to go and they moved quickly. So it really kind of depends on the volunteer groups that you have. But in general, the trainers, those out of the nonprofit organizations, did a really nice job of working with their volunteers to lead that at the particular areas. Next slide. So what we did is, at least for the pilot project, we wanted to make sure we had some city representatives along the way just to see and monitor how things were going and to be there for if there was any issues with either the tool or there were issues while they were walking through the neighborhoods. But it turned out quite well. As you know, the community-based organizations know the neighborhoods well. And so we identified partners that were familiar with the neighborhoods that we had identified, who could speak the languages in case people were wondering and asked questions about what are you doing out here, who could then articulate the purpose of the project and just put, minds at ease. We also gave all the volunteers a brochure. It's a trifold on what LUCA is and what we would be doing out in the neighborhoods. We also sent out those flyers ahead of time in some of the council districts where we knew we would be canvassing and ensure that people knew that our volunteers were on their way out there. They also wore a T-shirt that we have. It was a black T-shirt that said San Jose on it, just to make sure that they were clearly identified and people would not fear that it was government officials who would be knocking at the doors. On the contrary, we advised our volunteers to stay on the sidewalk, don't peek over fences, simply based on the criteria and the brief questions that are asked through the texting tool. to make a determination about whether or not there could be multiple families in one household. And so it wasn't about knocking on doors. It wasn't about going through gates. It was simply making observations from the sidewalk. So most groups did most of the work within the 2 to 4 hour period on a Saturday morning. Some groups decided to kind of spread out the canvassing during the middle of the week when it was more convenient for them. And that worked out quite well. Then what we did is we had a debrief with all of the nonprofit partners and identified some lessons learned. Next slide, please. What we learned was that while it's important to have community-based organizations recruit volunteers from the neighborhoods that we would be canvassing, it's not a requirement. We also had high school students from a private high school that canvassed a neighborhood they had never walked in and did a fantastic job. So as long as they understand the tool and they know what their role is in the community, any volunteer can do this work. But it does help to have bilingual volunteers who can, talk to people who come out of their houses if need be and answer questions. But what we found was that it really was quite easy to use. We also learned that we needed to do more advanced notices to the neighborhoods. And so in the next round, during a couple of weeks, we'll be canvassing several neighborhoods throughout San Jose. And we plan on doing a communications and outreach this next week and the following week via schools, council district offices, community centers, libraries, and faith-based organizations or places of worship, just to ease any anxiety about, volunteers going out in the neighborhood. So advance notice is important. So now the exciting piece to all this is really what happened as a result of this pilot project. And I'm going to hand it over to Ed Kissam so we can go on to the next slide and he can share with you what we learned.
Great. Well, thank you, Zulma. It's great to hear both about how it went in detail and your plans to refine the strategy still more and move forward. I think what I should do right now is just say that it's important to remember that the density of unconventional housing will vary from neighborhood to neighborhood in any given community and also from one community to another. Some have more concentrated deep pockets of marginal housing. In others, the housing is spread out much more broadly around a community. To look at that, a colleague who's retired from the Census Bureau and I have put together a targeting algorithm to help communities think about where it would make the most sense to go to look for unconventional housing, which is likely to have been left out of the master address file. So I wanted just to talk with you a bit about the Fresno pilot, which provides a slightly different picture because Fresno is a community that's quite different from San Jose in some ways and quite similar in other ways. In Fresno, the community-based address canvassing was done by the Central Valley Immigrant Integration Collaborative. And as in San Jose, it involved community canvassers who were bilingual. In Fresno, that meant in Spanish and in Hmong. They used a slightly different model than San Jose used, in that they did the canvassing over about a week and a half between Christmas and New Year's. The canvassing was flexible so that the canvassers could actually spend some time with their families over the holidays, but also move forward with the canvassing. In San Jose, as Zulma told you, there was about a 4.3% additions to the master address file. In Fresno, there was about a 6.3% addition to the master address file. And in San Francisco, about 3%. Overall, over all three pilots, about 4% was added to the master address file when we look at all 56 block groups that were canvassed. 56 census tracts that were canvassed. Overall, more than 40,000 housing areas with more than 40,000 housing units were canvassed. And so this all was done in a very short time, and all three pilots were successful. Each new housing unit, which might be a total household admission in the eventual 2020 census, in these neighborhoods has more than the average number of people probably, somewhere more in the order of 3.4 persons per household. So that represents a pretty substantial population that's added to the census rolls. I think that it's important to stress that the model, the strategy is flexible, and it should be adapted to whatever your local resources are and whatever your local housing conditions are. For example, in Orange County, there's a great deal of, likely to be a great deal of low visibility housing. And nonetheless, your community resources there are very different. We're talking to Salt Lake City, Utah, and to Charlotte, North Carolina, and to other communities. And in each community, there's the possibility of relying on different community groups to do the job. And as Zulma stressed, the pilots were done with community activist groups, but really any grassroots organization that knows the community well should be seen as a resource. One that always comes to my mind is Head Start, because Head Start knows their families well and knows the kinds of places they live in. Churches know where people live well, and in some cases, schools do also. So expanding the range of organizations involved in the community-based address canvassing is really valuable. Our hope is that, as you can hear from Zulma's presentation, what's learned as we go along can be shared amongst different communities which are using this strategy, so that we understand at the end of LUCA exactly how best to improve the Census Bureau's address file. And because we've been fortunate enough to be collaborating closely with the Census Bureau during this, there's some hope that this will actually make a contribution to their ability to do effective address canvassing in the 30% of the United States where they can do that address canvassing in 2019. So I wanted to say that those of you who do want to go forward with it, we would look forward to seeing you as part of a collaborative peer learning network, and we'd be happy to try and help however we can in terms of thinking through what the options are. So I think I should leave it there and have Jacob wind up. Jacob?
I apologize. I was on mute. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, we talked about this somewhat abstractly. We've heard about the San Jose and a little bit about the Fresno experience, but what's the sort of general model for doing this? What does this look like from an implementation side? And I will say, full disclosure, the census doesn't give that much time for this to happen. Many jurisdictions have received their master address file already. A few haven't, and from that point, you have about 120 days in order to submit updates. That said, as Zulma mentioned and alluded to, the process is relatively quick, and most of the time that's needed has to do with actually finding the areas that need this type of canvassing and identifying those, and then convening and getting commitments from CBOs to actually implement this. The training and the canvassing itself is really, really quick. And so if you all already have, either if you're a CBO and you have relations with your local governments, or you're a local government and you have good relations with a bunch of grassroots CBOs, this is something where it can be done really in a matter of weeks. Our suggested timeline is about 10 weeks. So with the first week being a kickoff and actually identifying those areas. So that might take a week or two. The sort of next step being actually convening the nonprofits, explaining to them what LUCA is, describing the opportunity and potential for impact. Once you actually get a commitment, typically there's some logistics around actually scheduling that train the trainer session, which includes the sort of classroom and field part that Zulma described, to then actually implementing that. So that would be week 5 on this. And then finally, the nonprofits need a little bit of time to schedule their volunteers and staff to actually go out and implement this. One of the nice things is there's not really, with our technology, there's not really any reporting that needs to be done. If you're using our technology, we get the data centralized. And so it's really easy for us to kind of clean up and then deliver to the county in a sort of computer-friendly format, so that it's really easy to incorporate into the census software system, which is called GUPS, or other GIS systems that they might use to ultimately compare addresses to their own list and submit it to the census via LUCA. So this gives like a rough idea of what that might take. For some communities, you might say, we already know the areas, we already have really great partners we work with, and so this could be compressed. For other communities, there might be parts of it that would need to be extended. But the actual work of it in training and actual implementation, as Zulma mentioned, should really only take a week or two at most, and everything else is just logistics around that in some sense. So next slide. And you might also be asking, what's the cost of this? So, these are rough numbers, but the cost for us of our technology platform is around $18,000 per city. And then because community-based organizations are, spending time in meetings as well as actually doing the training, and then they need food, materials, that sort of thing. We also work in San Jose and our other areas as well to give grants to the CBO partners. There's different sorts of setups that you can do for this. So something that we've done with LA County is sort of that option A, where we are sort of a single source justification for government, so that can bypass occasionally some RFP processes, or the other processes that can also work are engaging local funding communities, which is what we did for the San Jose pilot, where foundations and other partners, which often don't have the same competitive RFP requirements or other things in terms of timing, to get funding both for us for the technology or whoever your technology vendor is, as well as to the CBOs for actually doing the work. So, the bottom line, I think, for a medium-sized city, we think somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000, $60,000 could cover a really fairly sizable area. Next slide. So if you want to read more about this, and I think Neha will send this out. We'll send out the presentation. We've gotten some coverage for this in the New York Times, in the Fresno Bee, and as well as KTVU, and more recently in Mother Jones as well, about some of these efforts. Next slide. And so, we're sort of at the end and want to give you all some time for Q&A. So you're welcome to address questions to us. On the right-hand side, you'll find of the webinar panel, you'll find a questions sort of a sidebar, and you can just type them in there, and we'll be able to answer them as they come up. And of course, we wanted to thank you all for attending the webinar and learning about this. And we're looking forward to working on other parts of the census as well. So the first question we have is, are we going to be sending grant opportunities to attendees? So it'd be great to get a little bit more clarification on that. So I will say the state has a sort of state-level grant program for cities and counties, where depending on the state, they'll reimburse up to, depending on the city or county, the size, they'll actually reimburse some of the expenses. I think those grants range from $7,500 to about $100,000, depending on the jurisdiction. As for other funders, Ed might be able to speak to some of the other funding opportunities as he's tapped in there. Is Ed unmuted? 1 second.
Hi.
Okay, Ed, I think you're unmuted.
Great, thanks. Samuel, what I could add to your question is that surely the San Joaquin Valley is an area that I think really will benefit tremendously from lots of community-based address canvassing. And just so you know, I have been talking to the Sierra Health Foundation, not about funding from their foundation, because they're already supporting a great deal of marvelous community work in the Central Valley, but rather about their convening local governments from the main counties in the San Joaquin Valley to see what they might be able to do in terms of supporting this kind of supplement to their administratively based LUCA efforts.
Great. And I think we have another question for Zulma, if San Jose could share the documents they've put together to notify communities, as well as the pamphlets.
Absolutely.
So that's a question,
I'd be
more of a
happy
request.
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to share that. We have we're currently translating the materials to Vietnamese and Spanish, and as soon as those are final, I will share them with the group and Neha, and perhaps we can get those distributed, or people can contact me directly. That might be also the best way. And I think information on my email and so forth and phone number will be emailed out later. But happy to share what we have.
There's another funding question about, is it possible that a jurisdiction could have LUCA funds available to cover the cost to both nonprofits and Community Connect Labs? So, I mean, the state, sure, that state reimbursement, and unfortunately it is a reimbursement, can be used towards this. You know, as I think the person asking the question points out, it might not be sufficient to cover the full cost of that. I think that we've found that local funders, particularly community foundations, are amenable to this sort of work. But I think that, it's one of those things where the types of funders we've tended to work with are ones that are interested in civically engaged, like volunteering and that sort of thing. So we've partnered with Cities of Service as well, who is a key funder and partner in the San Jose project. So I don't think we have any particular funders lined up. We do know of funders who are interested in this type of work or census work in general, but we don't have any funding ourselves specifically for this.
So
honestly, if we did, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so back to that question about the reimbursable, I think that's really important because while it is reimbursable, it is important to have some bridge funding, and so we just recently had some bridge funding approved on contingent on getting that reimbursed to the city. The city doesn't just have money to flow out to LUCA at the moment, but we do believe that the state is going to reimburse us for those mini grants to the nonprofit organizations. And again, they're mini grants. We're talking about could be $2,500, $5,000, or $10, really depending on the number of volunteers that they pull or they recruit, and really the number of hours that they work. But I would anticipate that there are a lot of cities that are not going to ask for that LUCA funding, and what the state is doing is estimating what every city might need. And many cities are not going to be requesting those funds. So there's some money there. And it would be important to keep every receipt, document every hour that city staff or community-based organizations are working so that you can get reimbursement at the end. I do believe there will be sufficient funding because not very many cities, at least the ones that I pulled, will be doing anything around LUCA. So it's an important opportunity to take advantage.
Zelma, we have another question for you. If a CBO would like to see their city do this, do you have advice for how to convince their city leadership to actually implement something like this?
Gosh, that's a great question. I mean, there's nothing like having the community, influence some decisions around this. So if there is a community-based organization that's already been a good ally to the city, an important partner, and is willing to take on this lift, I think that local governments, particularly going directly to the city manager's office or city administrator's office, and communicating or conveying that there are partner organizations that are willing to help the city. And then the city can then contact me, and we could share the what we've learned and the resources and so forth. But it is helpful to get a partner who's already ready to go to convince the city. Otherwise, for many cities who haven't done this, like the city of San Jose, I wasn't involved in the last one. There's a little apprehension about how much work is going to go into it. But when you realize that you're really the convener and coordinator and some logistics, it's the partner organizations that do a lot of the great work. I hope that answers.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, is trying to find your city or county's LUCA liaison. So almost every city or county will have one. That person is often in an atypical department from what a CBO might work with, such as GIS or city planning. And really, it hasn't taken much to convince those folks the value of this sort of thing. But that might not be a typical relationship that a CBO would have. So I think just getting that conversation is something that's the sort of person to look for, like Zelma was saying.
This is Ed. Could I add something here? I just wanted to point out that the process of state grants to reimburse local government for their LUCA costs is a new endeavor, and there remain some issues to be worked out as to how it might be possible for smaller communities and counties to collaborate in a sort of consortium arrangement to do to do community-based address canvassing in more rural areas and in outlying communities, which may or may not have signed up for LUCA themselves. So that's something where I think the Institute of Local Government, and which all of you all in local communities should explore in dialogue with California Department of Finance, for those of you who are in California, and for those of you in other states, with probably with your state LUCA liaison.
This sort of LUCA work. So we can send you a link to Department of Finance, and they have information on that specifically. But basically, the guidelines I've heard from talking with them is once you've completed the work, you can submit your reimbursement very shortly after that. And then they should be able to get you that reimbursement by the fall, is what they're saying. But, you know, state government is state government. So there's another question for Ed. If a city government person would like to reach out to local community foundations but doesn't have those relationships yet, what advice does Ed have? Or should folks reach out to Ed directly and have him help make these connections?
I think that the only advice I can give you is to say that it's important to stress that these projects have to be completed very rapidly, and that you understand that foundations typically have a period of a number of months to turn around grants, and that the kind of possibility is that most foundations have their president or CEO has the ability to make small discretionary grants. And I think the sensible thing to do is to say, would it be possible to provide a rapid, small discretionary grant from the president's authority? I know that some of our foundation colleagues have a limit, say, of $10,000 for those sorts of presidential discretionary grants. And that's the only possibility.
And I would just say more generally, though we're obviously passionate about this particular type of work, we think that there's just a space for CBOs to be putting pressure on local government to be more actively engaged in census earlier, in part because this census is unprecedented in many ways, both being the first census that's going to be primarily online, the fact that they're trying to basically do a larger census because the population has grown with 40% less budget, which is just challenging for any kind of project to do to do more work with substantially less money. So for us, I think even if you aren't able to do community-based address canvassing, putting things like enumerator recruitment or undercount issues and starting those conversations early is just incredibly important. So I just wanted to leave it with that. I think we have one more question, and then I think we're going to have to end. Would the city manager know who the local or county LUCA liaison is? I'm pretty sure the city manager would know, because either they likely appointed that person or they might be in the city manager's office. So they would be a great person to go to find that out. Okay, I think that's it. Do you want to just say a word or two to wrap up, Sarah?
Yeah, that would be great. Also, just adding on to the question about who would know about the LUCA liaison, just in case the city manager doesn't, which depending on the size of the city, I could see, I would say the next person to definitely go to would be the city clerk. So that'd be my other piece of advice. We are at the top of the hour, and we do want to respect that everyone has other appointments to get to, but we're so grateful for your participation today. And please feel free to reach out to any of us who were part of this webinar today. We would love to talk to you more, and whatever we can do to help you connect to the folks in your community on these incredibly important issues, we absolutely want to do everything we can for you. So thank you, and everyone have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.